Okay, colleagues, greetings. So, we are making some progress in our course, which is not the easiest course I've ever taught, but we're trying to ask some big questions and to also give some hopefully interesting, stimulating answers. So there's a lot to talk about, and I plan to really hope to do a Q&A session after this primer right now. So I want to do this video maybe slightly shorter as a short primer because we're gradually moving towards social theory, right? So I cannot say that we have been able to give an entirely satisfactory account of the sort of, so to speak, the scientific approach to human beings, scientific anthropology, right? So how does within this grand scheme from protons to presidents, from electrons to elections, and also from Thales to Turing, right? So these are the big stories that we are telling, right? So protons, presidents, and electrons to elections, or also from Thales to Turing. From Thales, or actually Tao Te Ching, right? Tao Te Ching to Turing. I feel that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy these days wants to use D like this. Anyway, so yeah, so we begin with this very grandiose account of the Big Bang and the increase in entropy, with philosophers such as Sean Carroll and Mike Russell, who talks about how, one possible hypothesis of why life exists is an accidental byproduct of turning CO2 into CH4, right? And so then, again, I'm spending less time talking about this in the lectures because there are other things I want to do in the lectures, basically give you a broad outline, but the details of the story are there in the home assignments, in readings by Janet Richards, who talks about Darwin. There's readings by Stephen Stearns from the University of Yale, from Robert Wyman. Wonderful introductory chapter from a book by Francis Fukuyama. And then sort of also I encourage you to do, to take this up more maybe in your presentation topics. So this would be sort of scientific anthropology, like philosophy of biology. So from biology and biological anthropology. So these would be the names, right? And then if we talk about evolutionary psychology, right? So evolutionary psychology, and especially the modular theory of the mind. Modularity of the mind. Let me just write modular mind. These would be philosophers such as, again, Paul Bloom from the University of Yale. Robert Wright has a wonderful course on Coursera, although I have to always mention that I disagree with Wyman's take on Buddhism, but that's okay. His course still has some very interesting insights. There's going to be Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winning economist, a Nobel Prize winning psychologist who won Nobel Prize in economics. And maybe some other names that don't necessarily come to mind. Daniel Dennett is the leading philosopher still alive today who has a lot to say about these issues. So this is basically where we are in the course. This is like the course map, I want to say. And we, sort of this is the, I'm talking about all of these steps in the story in very general terms. I'm giving like a broad outline. Often I'm talking about like proofs of concept. And in many ways, I am trying to impart a certain different kind of worldview. And it's like when you change your worldview, like Thomas Kuhn talks about this paradigm shift, right? It's not like there's one thing that changes your paradigm. It's not like, you saw some neurobiological experiment and suddenly you have a new paradigm. It's a gradual shift, step by step, bit by bit. And notice, I keep talking about how science is not about truth, science is about credences, right? So it's about credences, and it's also about credences, not capital T truth. And it's also about, if you want, usefulness and coherence. And my point is that it's not like, so again, in general, what are we doing? We are doing, we are talking about a naturalistic approach. So naturalism, or like mechanistic versus teleological worldview. And this would be a naturalistic way of explaining human beings or human behavior, those kinds of things. It's like a naturalistic anthropology. And I don't expect any one particular piece of tentative evidence to convince people who are listening to this course, who are not on board, and most people probably are not on board with a naturalist worldview, but still. And I don't want to say that the naturalistic or mechanistic approach is just true. I'm not saying that. Again, ever since Socrates and Xenophanes, we don't talk about truth with capital T in philosophy. But I want to say that this approach appears to be more useful, more coherent. Again, appears, right? Sextus Empiricus, or David Hume, talks about how we acquiesce before appearances. This is this, pragmatic way of solving the skeptical dilemma, right? Getting out of skeptical conundrums. How do we know that we are not brains in a vat, or Boltzmann brains? How do we know that we are not being deceived by an evil demon? Anyway, and so our next step in the story is going to be talking about social theory. Sometimes people talk about this as sociology, and in fact, the first social theorists, some of the first social theorists, like Emil Durkheim, whom I'll talk about today, actually called himself a sociologist, right? He's one of the founders of academic sociology. I don't really like the word I have no problem with the word sociology, but I feel it's been co-opted recently by marketing studies, something like that, and PR departments, right? So I like to talk about social theory, not really sociology. And, it's a good question, where does social theory, it probably goes back to people such as Plato and especially Aristotle. It goes back to philosophers such as Giambattista Vico, philosophers such as Machiavelli, and very importantly, Hobbes and Rousseau and Hegel. And actually, I will want to step back and talk about Hobbes, Rousseau, and Hegel. So this would be sort of classical social theory, and I want to take a step back and actually talk about Hegel maybe in the next lecture. But sort of when I talk classical social theory, I mean Durkheim is also classical social theory. This is classical social theory being before Marx, let's put it that way. And then I feel that the three main names in contemporary social theory, these would be philosophers such as, again, Durkheim. Well, actually, before Durkheim, it's going to be Marx. So it's Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. These are the three pillars. These are the three main names. You could say Hegel, but Hegel is less of a social theorist and, more of a philosopher. What do these words mean? Are they necessarily well-defined? I'm not sure. So if you open, again, this wonderful textbook for this wonderful course, which unfortunately we're not taking, right? We're taking a different course. But this is the... if you're looking, this is the best study guide, and this is the best textbook that I know of for something like doing social theory. And if you open this brilliant textbook by a wonderful British social theorist and philosopher, Alex Callinicus, basically, yes, it's going to be Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. There are other chapters in the book, but like chapters which are devoted completely to separate philosophers. These are only Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. These are the three pillars. Okay. I mean, he also has a chapter on Hegel, and it's like if you want to watch my lecture on Hegel, go to Coursera, and there's a whole lecture on Hegel in my Introduction to Political Philosophy course. I'd love to give a full lecture on Hegel here as well, but I want to do something else with my time since I already have I think a pretty decent lecture on Hegel there. You can watch that there. So we're going to talk about Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. And it's like, two things I want to emphasize as we are. Again, this is not going to be I mean, ideally, this would be a lecture. If we were not in quarantine, if we were back in classrooms, this would be a lecture on Durkheim. But since we have the benefit of information technology, and I can record a shorter video as a primer, I feel maybe it's going to be more useful to do it this way, right? So I want to give some, again, this is more of a primer and a preview, and I want to give a couple of ideas as we are beginning, before we begin, so to speak. And so I don't know, like two things I want to say. So I mean, let's talk about free will and responsibility. And it's very interesting because, again, in Aristotle, in Vico, in Machiavelli, in Hobbes, in Rousseau, and in Hegel, there's a certain notion that human beings are products of culture. Humans are products of culture. And it's like responsibility, this moral, ethical responsibility that we talk about in our face-to-face interactions, does not exactly apply when we talk about these grand theories of society. So this is, this kind of, this is broadly speaking like the structural approach. And so the things that we have been talking about, how human beings, in an important respect, like don't exist. And don't exist as immortal souls, and human beings have no free will, right? So in an important respect, the social theorists who write before the discovery of DNA, who write before the discovery of the neurochemistry of the brain, they were already on board with this approach for other reasons, for reasons of looking very carefully at human experience as humans as social beings, right? This was already, I feel, quite clear to these philosophers, right? That, it's kind of... I mean, Durkheim is going to give a very dramatic example. He's going to talk about how a decision to commit suicide, presumably, so Durkheim on suicide, presumably is this very deeply personal choice that individuals make. But actually, Durkheim is going to say that if you look at statistics, you can identify factors. And even though you cannot predict with perfect precision who's going to commit suicide, the suicide rates from year to year are approximately stable. And let's say the suicide rates among Protestants are predictably higher than suicide rates among Catholics, right? And I feel that, Durkheim would say that if you imagine kind of this Laplace's demon scenario, Durkheim would say if you could really identify all the factors that go into a person's life, you could, in principle, predict with perfect precision who's going to commit suicide. Not in practice, but in principle. But what happens in practice, and there's this very beautiful, very important phrase, Latin phrase, ceteris paribus. Economists like to use it a lot. So other things being equal. So Max Weber calls this an einseitige Steigerung, an one-sided accentuation, an ideal type. So due to philosophers such as Weber. I'm sure there are other names I should refer to here, but let me just write Weber, right? So you identify a certain tendency, a certain mechanism. And actually, it's an idea from social science, but it's not just an idea from social science, because if I take something simple, I have my prop here like a pencil, and if I take a pencil and if I drop it, right, there are all sorts of forces which operate on a pencil, like, gravity, electromagnetism, strong force, weak force, Higgs field, and who knows what else, right? But you can abstract, let's say, air resistance, and just imagine that this pencil is a point of mass, and the Earth is a point of mass, and you can just calculate the trajectory, and the trajectory is going to be approximately true. And in this sense, the real type would be a combination of a very large number of ideal types. Maybe, who knows how many forces there are in nature, maybe infinity of forces. And there's an interesting parallel between, again, physics and social theory here, I feel. So this is thing number one. So we have this structural approach. Now, immediately, let me talk about a couple other things. So structure, agency. I don't want to use the word agency. So it's like you can think of large overarching structures, and you can think about idiosyncrasies. So let's talk about holism. This would be on the structure side. So holism, in general, from a particular Greek word, which doesn't come to mind immediately, but holism refers to, again, no relation to the word whole, but no etymological relation to the word whole, but definitional relation to the word whole, right? You take society as a whole. So so from the Greek word holos, which means whole, all whole, entire, right? So this is the idea, in some sense, that you need to look at the logic of the system kind of as a whole. And Durkheim has a wonderful phrase. He's talking about how society is a thing of its own kind, sui generis. Sui generis. It's a Latin phrase, sui generis. Again, this is due to Durkheim. How society has a logic of its own, a logic of its own. And it's related to this notion of ceteris paribus, of sort of certain kinds of mechanisms that operate other things being equal. I feel I've also misspelled ceteris paribus. Let me correct that. Anyway, so it's not going to be necessarily very clear, but also I feel, let me note this, right? So chemistry was a successful science before the quantum nature of the mechanical bond was discovered. The quantum mechanical nature of the chemical bond was discovered. Chemistry was a successful science. Likewise, biology was a successful science. Like it's like agronomy was a successful science before we understood molecular underpinnings of biology. So it's like you can have robust, useful knowledge without necessarily knowing the complete story of the foundations. And this notion of kind of sui generis, kind of like how certain levels of description have their own logic. This is kind of what I'm driving at. That you can be a doctor in ancient times, even though you don't necessarily understand exactly how the human body works. So you can have a relative, approximate, actually robust success in a field without knowing its foundation, without knowing its complete foundation. And spoiler alert, we don't know the complete foundation. Like, we don't have theory of quantum gravity. Maybe preons exist. Maybe string theory is true. So we don't have complete foundations even of physics, as far as we can tell, right? But still, physics is a successful science, right? So this has, a notion of emergence, complexity, and kind of relative autonomy of levels of description. Relative autonomy of levels of description. I hope this is clear to some of you. If you didn't understand very well what I was talking about right now, don't worry too much. Levels of description. But I wanna get it out there as an important piece of knowledge. So again, we talk about this again. Structural approach. So let me maybe. So structural approach. This would be holism. Holism versus. I don't want to. Yeah, you could talk about methodological individualism. So there's methodological holism. There's methodological individualism. Methodological holism or individualism. And I feel kind of both are right, but we have to understand individualism carefully, right? Because it's not really about, like, some people sometimes talk about structure agency. I don't like the word agency because I don't think that human beings have agency. But human beings certainly have idiosyncrasies. Idiosyncratic approach. So holistic or idiosyncratic approach. Holistic, idiosyncratic. So you have like quarks. So some processes, some aspects of reality are captured by large-scale structural forces. But then there are also individual idiosyncratic quirks. And let me write this. So I don't like structure agency because I don't believe that human beings have agency. Structure agency. But it's fine if you say structure agency if by agency you don't mean free will, but you mean idiosyncrasy. Idiosyncrasies of individual behavior. So idiosyncrasies idiosyncratic means it's a quirk which is due to this particular person. So it's like Protestants are more likely to commit suicide, says Durkheim. But whether this or that particular Protestant is going to commit suicide is due to their particular idiosyncratic, issues in their life. By the way, suicide is not a joke. Okay? Mental health is not a joke. If you are listening to this lecture, so public health announcement, I take this very seriously. If you are listening to this lecture and you are feeling depressed, please seek professional help. I say this because I feel it's a part of my professional responsibility. Also because, unfortunately, in the past, I've had students who were severely depressed. And I know that this can lead to deleterious consequences. So I'm not sure if these kinds of announcements help. But by the way, so in any case, if anybody has advice on how I should best give this, make these announcements, please let me know, because I do care deeply about the health, the mental health of my students. As you know, I like to see my students as my colleagues, and sometimes when certain tragic things happen to my students, I get very upset. It's not just me being upset; it's also I feel my duty, part of my duty as a teacher, but still. So of individual situation and development. But at the end of the day, methodologically, I feel that again, human beings are products of biological and cultural evolution. If you could take into account everything, then you would have a complete picture. I should talk about this at some point. Please, would somebody remind me? I wonder. Let's see how many students watch these lectures. Somebody remind me in class. So I have, there are these like genealogical, or if you want, diachronic charts from Robert Sapolsky, actually, and also from this wonderful book, which has surprisingly had a huge impact on me in terms of my understanding of philosophy of science. This is a book about psychology of intimate relationship by Thomas Bradbury and Benjamin Carney. I want to talk about this book at some point because it's a beautiful book. And in terms of its methodology, they also have something. They also have something very similar. Robert Sapolsky and also Carney and Bradbury. And what's the point? The idea is that basically, if you could, like, everything is the way it is because it got that way. Everything is the way it is because it got that way. And it means that if you could, like, go back and explain the entire history, starting, like, history of your genome, history of, this is already fairly, very, very large, right? How do you even account for the history of the human genome, right? But still, then you talk about, let's say, the history of. I'm not doing this very well because I need to look at the charts and explain this. Like history of the genome, like our ancestral history, like history of mammals. So this would be maybe history of, let's say, of genetics, history of mammals, history of hunter-gatherers, history of like your particular local population that you come from, history of idiosyncrasies of how your parents met, your particular parents, and then you could talk about epigenetics. And sort of your childhood, right? And also then your immediate environment, right? Do you see what I'm doing here? So it's like if you imagine this light cone, or if you imagine this pyramid, and you go like you start from afar, and you're moving closer and closer and closer, and you account like for the history of why is your DNA the way it is, sort of why are mammals the way they are, why are like human primates the way they are, why like what was happening to your parents, right? What kind of like imagine somebody's born during a famine, or imagine your parent, it's like, I'm really sorry for this tragic example, but let's imagine like your parents were exposed to high dose of radiation. I was actually born shortly after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. It's like I have to think about this. When I talk to my doctors about my prospects in life, right? And then you talk about sort of epigenetics. This would be like your like environment in the womb and exactly how your DNA was transcribed, right? Then you talk about like particular what was happening in your childhood environment, in your immediate environment right now. So you're moving closer and closer and closer. And if you could account for all of those factors every step of the way, then you would have a complete description of the human being. Obviously, it is impossible to do because it's a titanic task, worthy of a Laplace's demon. So not in practice, but in theory, this is how you account for human behavior. And since you cannot account for it completely, you can tease out certain large-scale structural influences. Like sugar is dense in useful calories. Like sugar is dense in energy. And sugar is used not just by humans, but by all sorts of animals. Sugar is used by plants to store energy. So you can see, right? So it's like you can have these large chunks of our genetic history that explains a lot, captures, has doesn't necessarily explain all the idiosyncrasies. There's a large structural influence. Or like radiation. Radiation leads to mutation in everything, in plants and bacteria and viruses and humans and mice. You understand, right? And kind of structural approaches, they paint using broad brushstrokes, and they can again give these broad predictions. Like, if you live near a nuclear power plant, your chances of getting cancer are higher. But whether this particular person is going to get cancer or not, this is due to individual idiosyncrasies. Right, so this is what I talk about, so structure agency. Wow, okay, this took slightly longer than I planned, but maybe it's okay. I hope it's okay. The next thing I want to talk about is again this maybe functional or functionalist paradigm, and this is the notion when we talk about the science of society, functionalism. And this is this issue between conflict and consensus. And the idea here is that, again, human beings are products of larger force of biological and cultural evolution. So to some extent, our relationship to our genes and to our societies is consensual, whatever that means, although question of values is a complicated question. And to some extent, it is conflictual. So sometimes our genes are like, it's kind of, especially if there's a time lag in evolution, can be, maladaptive, or your genes lead you to do something which makes you patently miserable. Likewise, sometimes societies take advantage of their members, like in terms of exploitation or, some sort of violence, right? And we will see this especially in Durkheim, this very, very interesting and I feel very fruitful medical analogy, which should be taken with a grain of salt, but I feel it's also very, very fruitful. So medical analogy, right? And how Durkheim is going to try as methodologically. So Durkheim is very much on the consensus side here. Durkheim, for methodological reasons, he's going to look at, it's like think of crime as functional. What is the function of crime? Not just as disease, but function of crime. So Durkheim, for example, would say that you need a certain healthy minimal level of crime to reinforce the social norms. Every once in a while, people need to break the norms and be visibly punished for it because this reinforces the social norms, right? So crime is functional. Or, it's like, again, suicides as maybe functional, or exploitation is functional, etc., etc. And Marx is going to be very much on the conflict side, or it's like talk about Durkheim. So crime is functional, religion is functional, religion is functional for Durkheim. So ideology is functional, ideology or patriotism is functional, or censorship, those kinds of things. There's more to be said, but I kind of want to stay on a fairly broad level of generality because I want to give a bit of a preview, right? And this is not going to be the entire story, and this is going to be our task, right? To see, again, these are like ideal types. Durkheim will invite us to see society as this organism, this organic medical metaphor. And let's say somebody like Marx is going to invite us to see society as a seat of conflict, seat of exploitation. And it's not like Durkheim is right and Marx is wrong, or Marx is right, Durkheim is wrong. No, it's like these are like different lenses, different sets of glasses that you put on your face, and from different perspectives you see different things. And by combining these different perspectives or these different paradigms, you get a more like a broader, more fruitful picture. Something along those lines. So, anyway. Let me think if I want to say something in general something else before we can. So it's like, it's an interesting jump because we're gonna stop talking in terms of kind of evolution and genes and like like this formula, fluctuations in the quantum fields seeking lowest energy states, right? So we're not going to derive precedence from protons, but basically we're going to derive social theory from other social theory. So in order to understand society, we're going to read not how sort of chemistry gives rise to biology, but we're going to read Hobbes and Rousseau and Durkheim, and it's an interesting conceptual jump, and I want us to constantly be aware. Now, the last thing I want to say by way of my primer, because I try to keep this short, is that I think that in terms of contemporary social theory, the main question that we're going to pursue is going to be modernity, and more specifically transition from traditional to modern societies. And so there's this transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculturals. That's an interesting transition, right? But then, even more interestingly, from agriculturals to industrial revolution. Industrial revolution is definitely kind of the birth. Industrial revolution is the birth of modern society. So agricultural, industrial. So industrialization. And so especially the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution are going to be our two main topics of interest. When I talk about the French Revolution, obviously I'm using the French Revolution as a synecdoche, right? As a metaphor. Synecdoche as a shorthand for the bourgeois revolutions all over Europe and for the emergence of this new, liberal worldview, nominal, formal democracy, which, as Foucault and Marx are going to point out, not exactly real democracy, but at least formally, emergence of formally free society. So industrial and French revolutions, right? And very interestingly, a couple of aspects that are going to be very important to us are going to be division of labor. So in many ways, Michael Bouravoy at Berkeley, who's one of the leading social theorists alive today, who was the president of American Sociological Association and World Sociological Association, Michael Bouravoy says that the division of labor is the most important topic in all of sociology, period. Like all of social theory can be built around division of labor. So division of labor and a related notion of how societies, because of the division of labor, or maybe because this allows division of labor, are dynamic, like are inherently dynamic, inherent dynamism of modern societies, as opposed to versus the static traditional nature of societies, of traditional societies. And also, even though I should be wrapping this up, let me just mention one other topic, and this is something I talked about briefly yesterday in class, and Igor asked me to comment on this. I'll comment on this much more, but as a preview. So there's going to be this very fruitful formula, which is due to Hegel. Again, I'm not sure if Hegel quite uses these words everywhere. In fact, it's actually quite hard to find these exact words in Hegelian corpus, but this is from Jerry Cohen. So this is Cohen explaining Hegel, right? But the words appear in Hegel, and Jerry Cohen is probably I would say for my money, one of the best interpreters of Marx in the 20th century. So, and the words are the following. So the concepts are the following. We go from undifferentiated unity, ununterschiedene Einheit in German, undifferentiated unity. In some sense, I feel that in Hegel, this actually goes back to some of the Neoplatonic metaphors that have to do with religious philosophy. To differentiated disunity, then to differentiated unity. So we have this three stages. You could think of this in terms of thesis, antithesis, synthesis if you want. So one example would be, so this would be like childhood. These would be, like growing pains. So this would be innocence of childhood. This would be growing pains, and this would be like conscious maturity. So this is I feel in so many ways is a very fruitful, and again, like this is a paradigm for thinking about society as a whole, right? So let me actually. Wow, I have so many typos. Apologies. It's difficult to talk and type at the same time. So these kinds of presentations flow a bit better when I do this in class. So let me give some more examples. So innocence of childhood. This would be, let's say, the master in master and slave dialectics, right, of Hegel, Herrschaft und Knechtschaft, or master Nietzsche. I feel so. You have this consciousness, unreflective consciousness without self-consciousness, unreflective, one-dimensional consciousness. And this would be maybe masters in Hegel or Nietzsche. And this would be maybe feudalism to some extent in Marx. Although, feudalism is a bit more complicated, but to some extent. When Marx talks about idiocy of rural life. So the growing pains, this would be emergence of reflection, but here we would have consciousness which is at war with itself. So it is reflective consciousness, but consciousness which is at war with itself. So emergence, so self-consciousness at war with itself. So Hegel is going to talk about this as being in itself. Differentiated disunity would be for another. And here we would have, obviously, so this would be slaves in Hegel or Nietzsche. Or this would be capitalism in Marx. And again, you can see how feudalism, again, you have this idiocy of rural life, but in capitalism, you have this dynamism, which is the growing pains. You have differentiation, emergence of individuality. Marx is going to say that in an important respect in feudalism, well, it's an oversimplification, take it with a grain of salt, but in some sense, there's no individuality or it's underdeveloped. Individuality emerges in capitalism. But then conscious maturity is it's like, so masters in Hegel, feudalism in Marx. So also in Hegel, this would be how the Athens execute Socrates, suppress individuality. Here, for Hegel, right? Here, for Hegel, this would be the French Revolution. How sort of here Athens executes Socrates. You see, the collectivity suppresses individuality. Collectivity suppresses the individuality. And here it is the individuality which undermines the collectivity. So, for example, Robespierre, it's an oversimplification, okay? It's an ideal type. Robespierre, undermines or destroys France. It's not true, obviously. Robespierre doesn't destroy France, but you understand, undermines the harmonious base of this idiotic, in a technical sense, premature harmony of French feudal society, which was not harmonious. I don't kid myself that it was harmonious, but you can understand. It's like, as an oversimplification, as a metaphor, you can see that it's capturing something about reality. So, in differentiated unity, finally, is going to be. For Hegel, this would be the emergence of the Rechtsstaat, constitutional state of laws. And in many ways, somebody like Jürgen Habermas is going to say that we are still struggling to achieve this stage. And Marx probably would agree that we are still struggling to achieve this stage. So it is consciousness, so being oneself with another. So it's for oneself with another. Consciousness for oneself with another. So it's conscious maturity. And this would be self-consciousness in harmony with itself and with its social environment. Apologies, I'm having to fight against PowerPoint every step of the way. So self-consciousness in harmony with itself and with others, with itself and society around it. And so let me just delete this, okay, and make sure I have enough space. Wow, something got broken, I feel. What did it look like? My face got deleted. That's okay. But you were able to see, at least to see the slides. That's not too bad, I guess. So should I look at what my previous slides were? I should be careful next time when I do these kinds of streams. I get carried away. Sorry. So anyway, this is probably the most important one. So self-consciousness in harmony with itself and society. So this would be, well, I would say citizens in Hegel. This would be Übermensch, the Übermenschen in Nietzsche, obviously. You can see very high stakes. Citizens in Hegel are supposed to be like Übermenschen for Nietzsche. And it's like I mean it quite seriously. If you want, let's discuss this in the seminar. This would be communism in Marx. And I feel that there's an interesting parallel between, again, what Hegel says, what Nietzsche says, and what Marx says. And yeah, so here we have the reconciliation of collective and individual, and this would be, again, for Hegel, this would be the Rechtsstaat, harmony of the Rechtsstaat, harmony of individual subjective inclination and the objective duty in the Rechtsstaat, harmony of subjective and objective in the constitutional state of the laws. Rechtsstaat literally means rights state, constitutional state. And again, I keep talking about this. In fact, I'm sure I talked about this in a segment I've uploaded yesterday. Again, this idea of free, which goes back to Rousseau. This is the project of enlightenment. Free obedience, free and eager, rational consent, obedience to the rational laws. You individually are rational. The laws of your society are rational, and therefore, you freely choose to obey the laws of your society. This is a very, again, pretentious and hopeful story, right? This is the promise of modernity, and philosophers such as, well, it's like let's try to say. So this, like, I'm probably gonna end with this. So this would be Enlightenment Optimism. So Enlightenment Optimism in who is an Enlightenment Optimist? Well, definitely in Hobbes. Rousseau is not very much an optimist, I would say, but definitely Hobbes, Hegel, and Durkheim, and Marx with a question mark, because young Marx was definitely optimistic. So let's write young Marx versus the pessimism, right? So pessimism about enlightenment. Philosophers who are gonna it's like, again, you see, Enlightenment Optimism, so this would be consensus, or something I tried to mention yesterday, this notion of hermeneutics of trust. So you can trust your society. And pessimism about enlightenment, this would be like hermeneutics of suspicion. And I would refer to philosophers who are pessimists. Well, I think older Marx was very much a pessimist, but let me put it with a question mark. So older Marx, definitely Nietzsche, very much a pessimist, and definitely Foucault. Okay. Some other names, it's like I could add a lot of names to this board. Ultimately, this is pessimismo dell'intelligenza, ottimismo della volontà. This is Gramsci. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Kind of in one person. So I'm not sure if this was super clear, but I suppose I should pause here because this was meant to be a bit of a primer, a bit of a preview. So it's like, again, we're trying to approach social theory, and social theory from the very beginning has this, again, partly medical approach, partly medical aspect to it. Sociologists or social theorists seeking to diagnose society and seeking to find like a path towards a brighter future. And I feel that, again, Durkheim and Marx are more on the side of optimism, especially younger Marx, feeling that we can reconcile, you can have free obedience to the rational laws. Hobbes, Hegel, Durkheim, young Marx. And older Marx, Weber, definitely Max Weber was a pessimist. Polar night of icy darkness, right? Philosophers who think that maybe society is always bound to be conflictual, and consensus is never going to be there. It's like this attitude goes back to the sophists, and this attitude goes back to Aristotle, I feel, especially in the Western tradition. Anyway, I plan to do this as a short primer. I've been going for quite a while, so let me pause here. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to relaunch this stream because I want to take questions, but I want to do this in a separate video. Anyway, colleagues, I hope this was useful. I hope you're intrigued. The next home assignment is actually posted. The home assignment is actually going to be Emil Durkheim from these two books. From this book, which is probably freely available on the internet because it's a study guide, and from this book, which is not really available anywhere, but it is available in our library. And so we're going to be reading Durkheim. Anyway, colleagues, until next time, stay safe and take care.